Hello and welcome to the SheClicks webinar about DSLR cameras. I'm Angela Nicholson and I'm the founder of SheClicks. Tonight we're talking about DSLR cameras and basically everything you need to know about them. But before we get properly started, we have a word from our sponsor. This webinar is sponsored by MPB, the world's largest platform for used photography and videography kit. MPB has transformed the way people buy, sell and trade equipment, making photography more accessible, affordable and sustainable. MPB is proud to partner with SheClicks to help support women photographers and their work. So thank you very much to MPB. And once again, they have loaned me a few cameras that I can show you towards the end of this webinar. Now let's look at what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to look at what is a DSLR, why you might want to use a DSLR camera, features to look out for if you're considering purchasing a DSLR or you want to use one. And then we'll look at some example images. And then we'll have some examples of DSLR cameras. I'll show you some cameras. Okay, so what is a DSLR? DSLR stands for Digital Single Lens Reflex. Obviously, before digital technology came along, they were just known as single lens reflex cameras. We didn't bother putting film in front, but once digital technology came along, people felt the need to differentiate between digital and film cameras. So they became digital single lens reflex cameras, or DSLRs. Now, the defining feature of a DSLR really is that it has a mirror that reflects light into the optical viewfinder. And I'll show you a diagram of where that is, but it reflects the light that comes through the lens up into the viewfinder, and that pings around and then pops out sort of directed towards your eye. So you see the image the right way up and the right way around. So it's not a direct view as such, but it's a clear, unadulterated view. It just comes through the lens optics, bounces off a mirror and then goes around the optics of the viewfinder. They also have a larger sensor than smartphones. They have a larger sensor than most compact cameras, but as you've seen, you can get APS-C format and full frame sensor compact cameras. So they're not bigger than all compact camera sensors, but they are bigger than all bridge camera sensors. And that brings advantages to image quality, because generally speaking, if you have a bigger sensor, it means that if you have two cameras with one's got a small sensor, the other's got a big sensor, if they have the same pixel count, the camera with the larger pixel count should produce better quality images, because the image requires less gain applied to it, because each pixel gathers more light. DSLR cameras actually have two focusing systems, and we get very used to sort of just tripping off saying, oh, it's got however many focus points and this, that, and the other, but they actually use two focus systems. There's one for use when you're using the viewfinder, and there's one for when the camera is in live view mode and you're composing the image on the back of the camera, on the screen on the back of the camera. But a DSLR, as I just sort of suggested, can actually work a bit like a mirrorless camera. And that's because it can lift the mirror out of the way so that the light goes straight through onto the sensor, and then it can feed that image directly to the screen on the back of the camera. It can't show you the live view image in the viewfinder because it's not wired up that way. It doesn't have a screen in there. It's just, it's optics. Whereas it can do it on the screen on the back of the camera. So that is a clear differentiation between mirrorless and mirrored cameras, or DSLRs. Now we've got, this is the Nikon D6, and as you can see, the front of it has been made transparent, so you can see the key components. And obviously, the sort of silver ring at the front, that is the lens mount. And beyond that, you can see the mirror lying at 45 degrees so that it can bounce light up into the viewfinder, which then, it's quite a strange prism shape, which bounces the light around. So eventually it ends up the right way around. So when you look at it, it looks like a natural view. Now, this is a section through the Nikon D5. And if you look, you can see all the optics of the lenses, all the elements. But if you see, there's a sort of sloping thing in the main area. As the light comes through, you can see when the mirror is in that position, it will bounce light up into that prism area at the top of the camera, and it will ping around and then pop out the viewfinder at the back. Now, you can see it looks like the mirror, the main mirror, is kind of leaning on something, but what that actually is a sub mirror. And parts of the main mirror have areas which are transparent, so light can pass through them. And then that light goes through to the sub mirror, and it bounces the light down into or onto, sorry, another sensor, a secondary sensor, which is actually the autofocus sensor. And that is where the autofocus is that is where they get the information for the autofocusing when the camera is in viewfinder mode, when you're using the viewfinder. If the camera is operating in live view mode, that mirror will lift out of the way and there'll be a clear path to the sensor. And therefore the sensor needs to be, the imaging sensor is used for autofocusing in live view mode. So that's a key differentiation, again, between mirrorless and DSLR cameras, because you don't need two autofocus systems with a mirrorless camera. Now, why would you use a DSLR camera? Well, firstly, they've got an optical viewfinder, and when when mirrorless cameras first came out and early bridge cameras, the electronic viewfinders in them were pretty terrible. They weren't very good at all. And whilst they have improved a lot, some people still don't quite get on with electronic viewfinders. Some people just don't like them. Some people just prefer that natural view, and that's perfectly fine. You don't see things like you don't see, if you adjust the exposure, you won't see it change in the viewfinder. The image will always look like the sort of natural view that you're seeing. And you won't see things like color changes or white balance changes. But a lot of people like that, so that they see that as a key reason for using a DSLR. Importantly, there's also very little in the way of blackout or in an optical viewfinder, because although the mirror has to flick up and therefore stops the viewfinder image, it's so brief, it doesn't really matter that much. And so it's very easy to follow a moving subject with an SLR camera. And, they have been very popular cameras for a long time with professional photographers and professional sports photographers who day in, day out follow fast moving subjects using their SLRs with the mirror flapping up and down. As I mentioned before, they also have a large sensor, and as well as that sort of being good for image quality, it also enables better control, or better ability, I should say, to restrict depth of field. So if you have a larger sensor and you use a large aperture, you will get shallower depth of field than you will if you use a camera with a smaller sensor. They also accept interchangeable lenses, and obviously that's a very important distinguishing feature between smartphones, bridge cameras, and compact cameras, because they all have a fixed lens, whereas you can change the lens on a DSLR. Now, some people, if you're new to photography, that might seem like a real faff, because you have to decide what you want to use, and it means you've got to have more, well, you potentially got to have more than one lens, but it means you've got a much more flexible system. So you can decide what you want to do, whether you want to, if you want to shoot macro photography, then you can put a macro lens on that's really designed for getting very close to the subject. Or, if you're into wide angle photography or landscape photography, you can use an appropriate lens. And if you want to shoot wildlife, you can go and get a really long telephoto lens and photograph wildlife without having to, if you've got a bridge camera, for example, you've basically got that long lens on there all the time. Okay, it doesn't look as big, but it's just a convenient feature that you can swap different optics around. You also get full exposure control. Now, we spoke when I was doing the session about compact cameras, we spoke about how they differentiate from smartphones. And a key element with smartphones is, although it's starting to come in, they don't actually give you they don't actually give you control over the aperture. They give you computational control over the impact of changing the aperture. So it looks like you're shooting at a wide aperture and getting a blurred background, but it's just, it's using actually the same aperture size. It's just sort of mimicking the effect that you'd get. Whereas with an SLR, you've actually got physical control over the aperture size and also the shutter speed. They can be used in viewfinder mode or live view mode. And that means, so you can shoot using the viewfinder, or you can switch to using the screen on the back of the camera in live view mode. And as I said before, when you're shooting in live view mode, you are you're seeing the image from the sensor. So you will see things like the exposure change if you adjust the exposure settings. You will see the white balance colors change if you adjust the white balance. And if you switch to black and white mode, you'll see a black and white image on the back of the screen. But if you switch back to viewfinder mode, you won't see those differences. So it's that means it can be quite flexible. Generally, they have a pretty large grip. I mean, obviously that depends a little bit on the camera size, but it means that they are better suited to larger lenses than a very small camera, and it makes them easier to hold. So, you know, if you're really into or getting into wildlife photography, then often you're going to want to use a long lens, and it's usually better, more comfortable, and feels more balanced if you've got a bigger camera. It means it has a bigger grip, but it also means that it's more robust. Now, you have to be careful, because if you have a small camera and you put a really big heavy lens on it, you need to be very, very careful that you support the lens and don't try and lift it with a little dinky camera, because the chances are you could do some damage. Now let's look at some features to look out for. Okay, so sensor size. Now, we're used to talking about full frame and APS-C size sensors, but what does that actually mean? Well, full frame is the same size as a 35mm film frame. So that, you know, we've just become used to talking about full frame cameras. That's actually what it means. And as I say, you can get some compact cameras with a full frame sensor. APS-C, it's a fairly standard size, I should say, sorry, for full frame. It's about 36 by 24mm. Sometimes it might be 35.9mm or something like that, but you know, it's pretty much there. APS-C format varies a little bit depending on the manufacturer. So Canon, as you can see there, uses the smallest APS-C size, and that's 22.3mm by 14.8, whereas Nikon uses a larger size of 23.5 by 15.7mm, and Pentax is somewhere in between. Now, they don't sound like big differences, but they have a little bit of impact when it comes to the lens, because there's something called the focal length magnification factor. So if you have a 100mm lens that you put on a full frame sensor, you'll get a particular view. If you take that same lens and pop it on a Canon APS-C format camera, you will see a cropped version. It will look like you've zoomed in further than 100mm. So it will look like it's a 160mm lens. Whereas if you put it on a Nikon camera, a Nikon APS-C, or what they call DX format camera, it will look like 150mm. And Pentax is near enough 150mm as well. So it's just a little difference, and it's worth thinking about when you're, you know, if you're thinking about buying lenses, you need to remember that there's that focal length magnification, because the lenses are marked with their actual focal length, not their effective focal length. So say if you're buying a 100mm lens for your Canon camera, it will actually perform like 160mm. Another important feature is to think about the pixel count. Now, a few years ago, certainly in the early days of DSLRs, there was something of a pixel count race, and everyone was desperately trying to get higher and higher pixel counts. That's kind of settled down now. I mean, we do still see high pixel counts coming out every now and again, but generally it's kind of settled down. And there's I think people understand the reasons why you might want a high pixel count or a medium pixel count or a low pixel count, because you get different benefits from each. So whilst a high pixel count camera, maybe 50 million pixels, something like that, is great for capturing lots of detail, and you know, it could be a really popular choice for landscape photographers if you want to make large prints, that kind of thing, or if you want to crop quite dramatically, a high pixel count camera is good. But with high pixel counts comes large file sizes, and that means that the card in your camera fills up more quickly, but also your storage that you have for your computer, that also fills up more quickly. And if your computer is perhaps getting on a little bit, you might find it's a little bit slower when you're trying to process, and particularly if you're trying to process lots of images, or if you're just waiting for thumbnails to render, it can slow things down a bit. So sometimes it's worth thinking about, well, what sort of, do I really need those pixels? Would I be better off with something more mid-range? Now, I did a poll, I don't know, about maybe a couple of years ago, I think, actually, and I asked people what they thought was the optimum pixel count, and I gave a few different examples, sort of 12, 24, 30, that kind of thing, 36, and most people voted for 24 million pixels. It seems to be something of a sweet spot, because you get a nice file size, it will produce a good size print, you've got plenty of information there to make, say, A3 prints, but it doesn't clog up your computer quite as quickly, it doesn't fill up your memory card as quickly. So it's a popular one. Lower pixel counts probably going to be slightly better for shooting in low light because the pixels will be bigger. So each pixel gets more light and therefore it requires less gain. So you don't get as much noise in your images. Lens mount is a very important aspect. And basically it just means that you need to bear in mind what the camera manufacturer's lens mount is. So Canon, for example, makes DSLR cameras with 2 lens mounts. There's Canon EF and EFS. Now, EF is the full frame lens mount, and you can use full frame lenses on the APS-C cameras, which use EFS lens mount. You can also put EFS lenses on your EFS camera because they're naturally paired. The thing is that if you buy a full frame lens and you put it on a smaller camera, a smaller, say, APS-C format camera, you're buying a bigger, heavier lens than you really need because it has to cover a bigger sensor. So sometimes you might want to buy APS-C format lenses, EFS lenses, rather than getting EF lenses. The thing is, if you think you might upgrade to a full frame camera, then you probably want to get full frame lenses because it saves you having to buy more lenses at a later date. But the important thing to remember with Canon is that if you have a full frame camera, a full frame SLR, you can't put APS-C format lenses on it. You can't use the EFS mount lenses. They physically won't mount, and that is because they would protrude too far into the camera, and it would, I think the mirror would actually hit the back of the lens and it would cause damage. Nikon and Pentax are a little bit more flexible. They use the same mount, regardless of whether it's APS-C or full frame. The mount is the same, but actually they still designate whether they're full frame or APS-C format. Nikon calls it DX format because, as I mentioned before, the smaller format lenses, they don't need to cover such a big sensor size. So it means that they can be made smaller and more compact. So if you buy a camera that you want because you want a small SLR, you don't really want a great big lens on it. If you're planning to use your camera primarily using the viewfinder, then this probably doesn't matter too much. But if you think that you might use it in live view mode, or you might want to shoot video, then it's well worth thinking about whether you want to have a tilting or a vari-angle screen. A tilting screen is great for landscape orientation shooting, whereas a vari-angle screen is helpful whether you're shooting in landscape or portrait orientation. And I find these really useful. Say if you're out shooting a landscape, camera's on a tripod, it doesn't have to be really low level. It might even just be kind of waist level. So it means you can tilt the screen slightly and you can look at it and make sure you're happy with the image without having to bend over. And it doesn't sound like a major drama, but actually if you've got a square on view and you're not crouching down, if you're shooting for a long period of time, maybe you're waiting for the light to come good or something to appear, it's just more comfortable. And also, it's better to get the screen flat onto your vision rather than be sort of looking at an awkward angle into a viewfinder, because you'll miss the composition a little bit. You often find that the level, the horizon isn't level and things like that. So it's just something to think about. Viewfinders come in 2 variants in DSLRs. There's pentaprism and pentamirror viewfinders. Now, a pentaprism is like a block of glass it's shaped in a particular way, so it pings the light around inside it. Whereas a pentamirror is similarly shaped, but it's got mirrored sides. Generally, a pentaprism viewfinder is found on higher end cameras, and a pentamirror is more affordable cameras. Now, that's because the pentaprism is obviously more expensive to make, but it tends to give a slightly brighter view, so you lose less light when you look in the viewfinder. And that's helpful if you're shooting at night or in dim conditions. You just get a slightly clearer, brighter view. It's also important to look out for what they call the percentage coverage of the viewfinder. So some cameras offer 100% view and others offer slightly less. So say if your camera offered a 95% view, that would mean that around the edges of the viewfinder, there could be objects that are in the image that you can't see. So for example, if you shoot a landscape, you compose it, and then when you look at the image, you realize there's a fence post on the very edge of the image that you hadn't seen in the viewfinder. That's because you haven't got 100% view. Now, obviously you can crop that out, but if you spent ages sort of lining up the image, you might not be very happy about doing that, but that's what you can do. Alternatively, you know, you could spend a little bit more and get a 98% cover, something like that, you know, but generally the higher the coverage, the better. And if you can get 100%, so much the better. But, you know, often 98% is a good value. Just need to just keep an eye on those edges. Generally, DSLRs are made of some form of metal, often magnesium alloy or a polycarbonate or plastic. Now, we can be a bit sniffy about polycarbonate, but it is can be quite a strong material. And particularly where manufacturers make it with using a monocoque design, which basically means it's all one piece. So then you have fewer joints, and so, you know, fewer opportunities for it to for stress and it to break. So it can be stronger, but generally metal is preferred. Sometimes the most robust cameras have a metal chassis. The sort of next one down is where particular plates are made of metal. So they might do the top and the back and the front, that kind of thing, but they don't necessarily make the whole chassis out of metal. So generally, say metal is good, and particularly, you know, if the front is metal, then it means that the usually means that the lens mount is going to be stronger and more durable, and therefore it's better for longer lenses. The number of focus points is often an important point. Now, if you have just a few focus points, then it means that you're more likely to have to do the focus and recompose technique. So you focus, and then you keep your finger on the shutter button, and you recompose, and then you take your shot. If you have more focus points, then the chances are you're more likely to get the focus a point over where your subject is. And it's also better with moving subjects because the camera stands more chance of being able to track it as it moves from one AF point to the other. So that's a useful thing to look at. When you have, interestingly, with an APS-C camera, the focus points tend to go further towards the edges of the frame than with a full frame camera. And it's to do with the size of the viewfinder and the autofocus sensor. So often with full frame cameras, they tend to be clustered a little bit more around the middle. You get lots of them, but if you want to focus on something right towards the edges, you're probably going to have to focus and recompose. Another factor to consider is the continuous shooting rate. If you're into sport photography, then the chances are you want a fast shooting rate. So, you know, we used to shoot, think 3 frames a second was quite good, then 4, 5, you know, but now if you're really if you want to catch those fleeting moments, then some cameras offer 10 frames a second or even 12 frames or more. So it's worth looking at that. And also have a look in the specs to see what the burst depth is, and that's how long it can maintain that continuous rate for. Because, you know, if it's shooting at 10 frames a second and it can only shoot 10 images, then basically you've just got a second. But, you know, if it can do 100, then suddenly you've got 10 seconds. And actually 10 seconds is a surprisingly long time when you're shooting a subject that's running or something like that. Also, have a look at the memory card, check what that is. Now, a lot of them use SD type cards, so SD, SDHC and SDXC, which all have the same format. It's just that they're different sizes. Sorry, different capacities, I should say. But some still have compact flash CF cards. Now, CF cards are very good. They used to be very popular, but they are bigger than SD cards. And I think one reason why they have sort of faded out, I think, is partly because they're a bit bigger, but also if you look that most, while laptops and computers tend to have an SD card slot, I've never seen one with a CF card slot. So if you're thinking about getting a camera with a CF card slot, that's not a problem, but you need to bear it in mind when you want to download your images. So you can either connect your camera to the computer, or you could use a memory card reader. And I would recommend going down the memory card reader route, because it means that you're connecting and disconnecting a memory card reader rather than your camera all the time. And, you know, memory card readers are pretty affordable, whereas your camera is obviously going to be a bit more of a significant investment. Other things to think about are weatherproofing and Wi-Fi connectivity. Weatherproofing obviously is really useful if you want to go out in inclement weather or less than perfect weather, or you want to go out and not have to worry too much if it starts to drizzle. And again, you know, if a camera is weatherproof, then the manufacturers will let you know about it. So it's worth just checking the marketing materials. Wi-Fi connectivity is really useful for, it means that you can connect your phone to your camera so you can take remote control over it. So if you're out shooting something and you want to do a long exposure and you don't have a remote release, and you're worried that because if you press the camera to press the shutter button, you're likely to introduce shake, you can trip it with your phone instead. You can also adjust features, and you know, you can transfer images to the phone to post, if you like, online. So they're two useful features that are quite common now. It's worth bearing in mind with Wi-Fi connectivity, you don't need to be in a Wi-Fi zone or anything like that. You can be in the middle of nowhere. It's just that the camera's got its own Wi-Fi system built in, and it will create a signal that your phone can connect to. Now let's take a quick look at some example images. Okay, so this was taken with the Nikon D3400, which was at the time, it was Nikon's entry-level SLR, and it was a very good camera. It's now it's been superseded by the D3500. Great camera, 24 million pixel sensor, APS-C format. But the reason I just included this image is just to say that, you know, I think people suddenly think they have to step up in a sort of level of seriousness when they have an SLR, but they are also suitable for just general out and about photography, snapping. You know, you go out, this was taken during a day out in Oxford, and I've got a bit of an obsession with bicycles in Oxford in particular. So this was just one shot that I took. It's just, you know, they're great quality cameras, but you could use them in all sorts of situations. Similarly, this is the same camera. This was shot in the covered market in Oxford, just a nice sort of detail shot. If I had had a macro lens, I could have popped that on and gone really close to one of those tomatoes if I'd wanted. So you've got lots of flexibility. You can shoot all sorts of things. Now, this is shot with the Nikon D6, which is Nikon's flagship DSLR, and it is a fantastic camera, and it has got a superb autofocus system. But actually, many DSLRs have very good focusing systems, and you could capture a nice sharp image of a dog running or anything else you want. But Otto has to feature in all our webinars, so here he is. This was shot with the Nikon D780, which is, I think Nikon's, I think I'm right in saying Nikon's most recent SLR, most recently introduced. I think I shot this ISO, actually, I can't really remember. It might have been ISO 1600. It might have been a bit higher. I'm not sure. But my point is here that, you know, this is just a nighttime landscape image, long exposure. You can shoot all sorts of stuff with DSLRs. They're really, not, you know, they're unlimited. So switching now to Canon EOS 90D, just to demonstrate that you can shoot sport with DSLRs, and this is very much an enthusiast level camera. It's not a pro model. So you know, just to show that you can capture movement, and you know, the shutter speed and the focusing and everything is perfectly good. This was also shot on the EOS 90D, and I'm pretty sure I shot this using the live view mode, in which it has eye detection. So I used that to focus on the model's eyes. This shot again with the EOS 90D, it's kind of deceptive because actually, because the go-kart driver is going through a pool of light and it looks really bright, it was very dim. There was just, it was quite, there were a few continuous lights putting a pool of light onto various parts of the track, but it wasn't that bright. It's just the exposure that has made that look particularly bright. It was very glooming. I think this was at ISO 6400. And you can see there is some texture there. There's a little bit of noise, but actually, you know, it's pretty good. The autofocus system has coped with the low light, and it's got a very sharp image. You know, it's frozen by the shutter speed. So just to show you that, you know, you can shoot in low light as well with DSLRs. Okay, so now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll have a look at some cameras. So the first camera I'm going to show you is the Nikon D3500. Now, I I mentioned the D3400 earlier, and this is its successor, the D3500. I've just popped, this is the 18-105 lens on. Most of the cameras I'm going to show you tonight haven't actually got lenses on, but I just popped this one on because I want to show you something else, and it will only work with a lens on. So as you can see, this is a really nice compact SLR. It's actually very slim across here. You can just see that. It's just, there we go. You can see it's very slim across there, which means, there we go. You can see there's a good deep grip. So it's actually very comfortable, and it's a remarkably light, and it feels tough. You know, if I sometimes with some entry-level cameras, you grip it really tight, you get a creaking sound, but there's none of that with this. It feels very solid, yet it is light, and you know, it's a polycarbonate construction. You've got a mode dial, you've got, I say it's APS-C format. There's 24.7 million pixels on the sensor. As I mentioned earlier, it has a 1.5 times focal length multiplication factor. And one of the key features about Nikon's entry-level cameras is this guide mode. You still get, you know, the manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, and program, and some scene modes, but this guide mode is a really good way of learning about photography at the outset. So if I just turn it on, go to shoot, you have the option of whether you want to use easy operation or advanced operation. And the great thing is it explains things without sort of using very technical or photographic language. So if I just choose easy operation, it shows you, it helps you select the right mode. So it's kind of like an advanced or slightly more sophisticated scene mode. So but it tells you what mode you're actually using. So next time you might decide, actually, you know what, I'm going to put the camera in sports mode because that was the option I used. Now, if I just go back and this time select advanced operation, this time it's similar sort of situation, but it's explaining slightly different things. And then if we select it, it tells you that you would use aperture priority mode. If we go to next, you've then got the option to start controlling the aperture directly from within that mode. So it's just nice and simple. You're learning about what's being controlled. So eventually, after you're doing that a few times, you might decide, well, I'm going to shoot in aperture priority because I've learned about that mode. So that's a really useful feature. New, this cost about, it was about £400, and you can buy like new now for about 340, something like that. You know, good condition D3500. So that's that. Now let's look at the Canon EOS 250D. Now at launch, this was billed as the world's smallest DSLR with a movable screen. And by movable screen, they mean that this is a vari-angle screen, which is really useful, as I say, because it's useful for low-level photography, in portrait, or sorry, in landscape orientation or in portrait orientation. So you can shoot like that. So that's really helpful. And this also has a guide mode. It's slightly different to Nikon's. If I just turn it on, let me just, there we go. So it shows you that in, so it's in TV mode at the moment. Sorry, it's just obviously having a little bit. There we go. Oh. So it will show you what happens if you adjust the shutter speed and things like that. And it would do the same in aperture priority, but as there's no lens on, it's not doing it. And you can change if you want. So this is the guided mode. You could switch to the standard mode when you're a bit more comfortable with the way it works. So if I just, and you've got other control options as well. So there's the guided mode for that, and there's the standard display. Okay, so that is the Canon 250D. New, it's £529, but you can get it for just over £500 in like new. It has, as I said, it has the EFS mount, so you can use EF or EFS lenses on it, APS-C format, 24.1 million pixels. So it's about the same resolution as the Nikon D3500. It has a 1.6 times focal length magnification factor. Nice benefit of this camera is that it's got Canon's dual pixel CMOS AF system. That means that the sensor, the imaging sensor, has phase detection pixels on it. And that is a fast and effective form of focusing in live view mode, whereas the D3500 uses contrast detection in live view mode. So whilst its focusing is very good when you're shooting with the viewfinder, the D3500 isn't so great in live view mode, whereas this is very good in live view mode. And of course, as I say, you've got the vari-angle screen, which makes you more inclined to actually use live view mode and or the menu, and it's touch sensitive. So that's very handy. Now I'm going to talk about, we're going to step up to the Canon EOS 7D Mark II. So it's immediately, you can see it's a bigger, chunkier camera. If I just bring in the, we got enough room, you can see those side by side. The 7D is a much bigger camera, much chunkier. It's also more robust, and it has the top, front, back are made from magnesium alloy, and it's weather sealed. So that's reassuring if you want to go out in the rain, or perhaps down to the coast with it, and it's a bit drizzly, or there's spray. It has a 20 million pixel APS-C sensor, so it's actually lower resolution than the two previous cameras, but that should make it better in low light. It also it has the same EFS-S lens mount as the 250D, and therefore it has a 1.5 times focal length magnification factor. But one of the nice features about this is really designed with enthusiast sport and action photographers in mind, because it can shoot at 10 frames a second. And it has a 65-point AF system in the viewfinder mode. And they are all cross type, which means that basically they are the more sensitive type, because the alternative is linear, and it just means better at detecting subjects. So it can, it will focus on them quickly. On the back of the camera, you'll see that the screen is fixed. It's not a vari-angle or a tilting screen. You'll also notice that the layout of the buttons, that firstly, there are more buttons and dials than on the 250D, and the layout sort of adopts a more advanced, it's a more advanced control layout. Nice feature is you get a joystick on the back of the camera, and that's really useful for setting the AF point while you're looking in the viewfinder. So really nice camera. New launch, it was about £1,800, but now you can get an excellent condition one for about £700. So quite a considerable drop in price. A very solid, dependable camera. I know a few people who've used those and really loved it. So now we're going to look at the Nikon D780. And if you remember, I used this to photograph the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis. So in the thing. Now this is a full frame camera, and it doesn't actually feel, let's just put it alongside the 7D Mark II. It doesn't actually feel much bigger. In fact, I think it's smaller than the Canon's APS-C. So full frame camera. It will shoot at up to 12 frames a second. So very fast, great for action. It's a good all-rounder. It has a 24 million pixel sensor. So it's a nice compromise in terms of detail, capture, and file size. It's got the Nikon F mount, which I said it can be used, you can use that. You can use APS-C format or full frame lenses on this. If you use an APS-C format lens or DX format on here, it will crop it, so the image, you won't use the full sensor area. 51 AF points, sorry, available with the viewfinder, and 273 points also with IAF in live view mode. And this is actually the only camera only DSLR in Nikon's range which has phase detection pixels on the imaging sensor. So it actually uses the same sensor as the Nikon Z6, which means it's got the same focusing system in live view mode, and it is much faster than Nikon's other DSLRs in live view mode. So it's a very capable camera. It's got a tilting screen, which is good. Not quite as good as a vari-angle, but it's pretty robust. And if I open this up, you can see it takes 2 SD cards, which is handy. And I forgot to show you that the 7D Mark II is a little bit different because it has got an SD card and a compact flash card, CF card. So there's a new format called CF Express, and it's not that, it's the old CF. Some people would prefer 2 SD cards because obviously, you know, SD cards are more prevalent. It gives you the option to back up and as you're shooting and that kind of thing, or you can split different files across one sensor, or sorry, one card or the other. Okay, so that is the Nikon D780. That new retails for about £2,100. If you were to buy a like new one secondhand, you could probably get it for something like £1,680, something like that. Now, where is? Okay, now we're on to the Canon 5D Mark IV. Canon's 5D range or line has been incredibly popular with semi-professional photographers, enthusiast photographers, and professional photographers. It's been used by people for shooting weddings and you know, all sorts of different genres of photography, to be honest. But it was the 5D range that also really kick-started the trend for shooting video with smaller format cameras, or, you know, non-video or filmmaking cameras. This has a 30.4 million pixel full frame sensor. So you've got, you know, good image size, but not too big. There are 61 AF points with the viewfinder, and it also features Canon's dual pixel CMOS AF, which basically means that it's got phase detection pixels covering most of the sensor, which means that it's really good at focusing in live view mode or in video mode, which is a nice bonus. On the back of the camera, you can see that is a 3.2-inch screen, which is a nice size of screen, but it's not tilting or vari-angle or anything like that. It's just fixed. You can shoot 4K video on this as well. It will shoot at up to 7 frames a second, and it has a magnesium alloy chassis that is weather sealed. And I'll just open this, as you can see, like the 7D Mark II, it takes SD cards or CF cards. Put one of each in if you like. So that was the 5D Mark IV. Oh, I didn't tell you that 5D Mark IV retails for around 2,870, or you could probably get one in excellent condition for about £1,000 less, so 1,800 and something. So quite an attractive proposition or saving for going secondhand. This is the Nikon D850, and this is another camera which has been incredibly popular with professionals and semi-professional photographers, enthusiast photographers. It's because it combines sort of speed, low light capability, and high resolution. It has a 45.7 million pixel sensor. It's a full frame sensor, and it can shoot at up to 7 frames a second, sort of as it is. Or if you have the optional battery grip, it would shoot at 9 frames a second. So it can be used, you know, for action as well as sort of routine photography. It's been very popular with wedding photographers. It has a tilting screen, which is nice. Again, you know, not quite as flexible as a vari-angle screen, and it can't, you know, you're not going to shoot selfies with this. And again, it's a 3.2-inch screen, so it's a touch screen, which is nice. It has a magnesium alloy chassis again, and it's weather sealed. The downside with this is, as I mentioned earlier, this doesn't have phase detection in live view mode. It only has contrast detection, and it's not the fastest. It's not terrible, but it's not the fastest. And I think because we've got used to now having phase detection in live view mode, it's just, you know, not as nippy as perhaps we might be used to. So that's the Nikon D850. It retails new for about £2,700, but you could pick up a like new secondhand model for £2,200, something like that. So again, a nice camera that is attractively priced at, you know, or is an attractive saving if you went for secondhand. So that's Canon and Nikon. I mean, both of them make flagship cameras as well, which are, you know, double grip. I showed you the picture of the D6 before. There's the Canon EOS 1DX Mark III, which are, you know, the D6 and or the D5 and the 1D range from Canon. They have been used by professional photographers, and you know, they don't have the highest resolution, but they're great in low light. They're really robustly built. But I focused on the sort of entry, medium and upper level without going to flagship for this talk. So that's Canon and Nikon. I just wanted to show you something a little bit different, Pentax. Because wherever Canon and Nikon have started making mirrorless cameras, Pentax had a little dalliance with it, but has announced that it is going to be and remain a DSLR manufacturer. This is one of the older Pentax DSLRs, because it's the K1 was the company's first full frame DSLR. It has been replaced by the Mark II, which doesn't actually make a massive difference. It's not a huge step up. So, you know, I couldn't find a second-hand price or even the new price for this actually when it came out. But you probably pick it up quite a bit cheaper now. The K1 Mark II cost about £1,800 new, so I imagine you could get quite a saving if you went for second-hand. It has some interesting features which is why I wanted to show you it. Firstly, I mean, it's a 36 million pixel full frame sensor, so it's quite affordable for a full frame camera. It's very robustly built. It has weather sealing. It also has an unusual screen. It's, you know, you can tilt it in different directions. You can see inside there's these kind of struts, and they enable me to do that. And when it first came out, I was encouraged to do this to show people how strong that is. So it's a pretty tough camera. So it, you know, it's suitable for use in harsh environments, rain, spray, that kind of thing. It's quite an advanced camera in that, you know, it's got all the PSAM modes and a few extras that Pentax offers. You've got direct control over some features over here. There is direct control to things like, you know, ISO, sensitivity, metering. You know, it's nice, it's quick operation. The menu looks a little bit dated. Let's put the menu there. You see it looks a little bit dated, but it's perfectly effective. You know, you can navigate around. It's just Pentax's style. They didn't do anything fancy. It's got a 33-point AF system with the viewfinder. And I have to say, it's not the fastest. You know, it's not ideal for sports photography or action photography, but it's great for other things, you know, landscape or still life or portraits, that kind of thing. It also has something called pixel shift resolution mode. And whilst it doesn't, what it does, it takes 4 images, moving the sensor a little bit because it's got stabilization system built in, and then it composites them. It doesn't make them into a big image, but what it does is it combines the color and detail information. So it produces an image with a little bit more detail and better colors. And it's subtle, but there is a difference. There's also an interesting star tracking or astro tracer mode, and in that mode the camera uses its GPS system in combination with the sensor, the ability to move the sensor, and it moves it to keep track of stars in the sky so that they don't blur. So it could be interesting to someone who's you know, if you're into astrophotography or something like that. And I say, because it's so rugged and weatherproof and pretty hefty, you can knock it around a bit and take it all sorts of places. But don't buy it if you're interested in sport photography, because the autofocus is quite slow and it only shoots at 4 frames a second. Okay, so that is a small collection of cameras that I wanted to talk to you about. Thank you very much for joining me. Have a good evening.